And we're recording. Hello, Ivo.
Hello, Talia.
How are you? So you were talking to us live from Phoenix, Arizona in the US, but you're from Belgium.
That's right.
Where my
And
grandma.
about half of the year, about 6 months a year, I usually spend in Colombia, South America.
And yeah, right. And then there's the Colombia connection, although that's not how we know each other. We know each other because we met at a biohacking conference in 2018
Yes,
in
in
Toronto.
Toronto.
And you are a certified biohacker, although there is no such thing as a biohacking certification. You're you're a self-hacker.
Yes, I'm always looking for ways to improve my health, to improve my life, and to improve my happiness.
Awesome. Yeah. And so what's biohacking? Can you define it for us? Can you tell us what it is?
I think the most common definition used nowadays is biohacking will be anything that you change in your environment to improve your performance in any which way. It can be mental performance, physical performance.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right. So it's more about optimization of health.
yeah.
And so,
For,
like,
for example, well, like a small little example, when I was 13 years old or 15 years old, I was always really interested about these small little articles you would find in the newspaper saying, oh, if you drink pomegranate juice, then your physical, like you can run for an hour longer or you will run much faster. Like all these little tweaks, and mostly with food, always seemed so interesting to me. And that's how my journey started. I'm like, oh, if I eat these foods, then things change. If I eat a lot of lentils before doing a hard workout, the workout feels so much easier. And over the years, I found so many more things that work really well for me and maybe don't work well for other people. And that's the
like,
journey.
yeah, like started at age 13 where you're like, oh, if I tweak this thing or eat more of this thing, I'll get this outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And did you find that pomegranate increased your endurance?
I, for me, pomegranate mostly increased my libido, and you could say sexual endurance. Physical performance, I haven't really found any difference now.
Well, so it's a form of physical endurance.
Exactly.
And so you were okay, so you would take these tweaks, like certain foods that you can eat or things you can do to get certain outcomes based on certain values you had. Like I want to run faster, I want to have a better workout, I want more mental, maybe mental acuity, creativity. And then that sort of catapulted you
Yeah.
decades later
And
into continuing to do this.
it wasn't always that way. I think everything changed when I was 27 years old. In my 20s, I had a shoulder surgery. And because of this, and I never did any good rehab or like substantial rehab, my arms were rather small compared to my chest. And I remember going to Thailand with a friend and had a beach picture with my friend. And went through our pictures and he kind of mentioned, it looks like your arms are too small for your chest. And I looked at the picture and I was like, was obvious, like, it doesn't look right. And at the time I was living in Peru and I went back to Peru and I just, oh, I'm going too fast. First of all, my brother came to visit me, and for 2 months, we would do physical exercise every day. We would go for a run, we go swimming for an hour, we do all kinds of stuff. We would do Muay Thai. I did a lot of Muay Thai then, but that doesn't help you get big arms. I would get very, very lean, and in fact, even so skinny that a lot of people were like, "Oh, are you okay?" And like, not, it wasn't really a look that fitted me well. Also because I'm tall, I'm 6'1". And so after this period of 3 months of being very physically active and being very lean, because I had a little bit of a tummy before, I was like, these arms, man, these arms are so small. And then I Googled how to get bigger arms. And I found this article on bodybuilding.com that changed my life. I think it was by Doberman Dan the Man. And this is really a good article. And that was my first step into biohacking. I looked at the article. I took every single point to the T, followed it to the T, to the letter, tracked my calories for the first time in my life, worked out for the first time in my life, writing everything down. So I would write down how many reps, how much weight, how much rest period. I would keep the rest period consistent. I would never work out longer than 45 or 50 minutes. And this was like how to get bigger arms in 31 days. But I did it for 3 months. And after 3 months, my brother came back, and I hadn't even really realized. I mean, I was getting bigger. I was getting reactions from people. And my brother is like, "What did you do? How much did you train?" All of a sudden, my biceps were bigger than his biceps, and he always had big biceps, and they were leaner. I said, "I don't know. I just worked out 3 times a week. That's it." But I went to bed early. I ate well. I counted all my calories, weighted all my food, and yeah, it was like the first time. Like, wow, you can have really big results in only 3 months. Really sticking to it, to the plan. No need to make decisions. You develop the plans once. You write down the plan once, and just stick to it. And if it's not according to the plan, I just don't do it. I would not even go to bed before I had all my calories in for the day. So I gained a lot of muscle, and since that was like the main event that to me was like, wow,
Mm.
you can really accomplish a lot of things.
Mm. It's so cool. So you remember what the tips were that Dan the man had?
Mostly was up your protein, up your calories, track all your food, weigh all your foods, and sleep, rest. And it was even because this was an article focused on muscle mass. It was even like, don't exert yourself too much on non-workout days. So for me, especially in general in my lifetime, it was always pretty easy to be skinny or to be lean. I'm mostly skinny. And so especially for people like me, it's important. If you want to gain a lot of muscle mass, it's not going to work if you're like riding your bike 2 hours a day.
Mm.
You'll be burning so many calories. You'll have to eat astronomical amounts. And I ate like it was my job. It was like many times like, oh, I don't want to eat anymore, but if I want to get these bigger arms, I need to. Yeah.
It's also, so it is like a food plan, a lifestyle plan in terms of how much to sleep, instructions on how to work out, how to rest, and it was this strategy that you just deferred to. So it's like you kind of um, just allowed this plan to be your guide and
Exactly.
committed to it for 3 months instead of the 31 days that he was recommending, and then you started to notice results. And then this sort of was the moment that you were hooked. You're like, this stuff
Yes.
works.
Actually, the thing that really got me hooked is because all of a sudden it was enjoyable to work out. Because before I would go to the gym like a month here, a month there. I think over my whole life I went to the gym like when I was 24. So that's 3 years before that. I went to the gym for 2 months, but I didn't like it because it was like so annoying. The weights, the repetitions. When I followed this plan, it was like you need to write everything down. So I would be in the gym. I'd be like, oh, I feel strong today. Oh, it's going great. And then I look at my notes from the previous workout. I'm like, oh, I only did 9 reps. And last time I did 10 reps. Well, my brain is fooling me. I'm not strong. I'm doing less. So every time I was okay. I need to try to push another rep in. So it always helped me to push and to push. And I wasn't even planning to do it for 3 months, but I was just so addicted to the constant progress. And some days the progress was better, but like with a bigger jump, and some days it was a smaller jump. But it was just so enjoyable to have like this 3 weekly competition with myself that before I knew it, my brother came back from the trip after 3 months, and I was like, oh yeah, I actually did work out for 3 months, I guess. Yeah. So
Right. It's like you're gamifying it and you're using
yes,
this incentive to gauge your progress as opposed to just showing up at the gym with no real
yes,
marker of how you're doing.
yes.
I remember this. Yeah. Like I think I was on the triathlon team in university and would just do hours and hours pumping out cardio, no results. Right. And so you start to lose momentum. You start to develop negative associations with going to the gym because you're like, this is punishment, you know?
Yes,
But when you're building in rest time and when you're able to see your progress, it's like there's
yes.
something motivating about it.
Yeah, totally. That was night and day for me. And even now, like I've been traveling all over the world. I've been to so many gyms. I barely ever, I think I've never seen someone else write down his progress or write down everything in a notebook. I believe nowadays a lot of people might use their phones, their apps like JFit. But even me, I use my phone, my app now. Sometimes I feel like just pen and paper and having this book with you, like this tiny little notebook with that has sweat and tears on it, is just something very different.
And this is one of the hallmarks of biohacking is tracking, right? There's this, and you have an Oura ring, I have an Oura ring, and there's like these devices and things you can use to track and graph your progress in certain areas. How's your sleep doing? You have your little notebook, like how's my workout? And then you're connecting different variables. So you're deciding, okay, why did my gym session, why did I not get the results I wanted in the last gym session? Or why did I not improve upon my old score, essentially? And then you're looking at, well, am I not resting? Is there something to do with diet, something to do with sleep? And so you're trying to like associate these different variables to really essentially hack the outcomes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, exactly. And this with the Oura ring, this reminds me now about how I've been hacking my food intake, for example. So I had the Oura ring, and the first few weeks and months, it's pretty much accumulating data. And at the same time, I was also actually tracking what I eat and what time I ate it using another app called MyFitnessPal. And so after a few months, I compared the nights that I slept exceptionally well with what did I eat that day. And I like having a big dinner, but the data, I would like after 2 hours of making all the notes, it was very clear to me that if I stopped eating at 5 p.m., or actually if I didn't eat much that day, I slept so much better, so much more deep sleep, more REM sleep. So I couldn't argue with that.
Mm.
And I would also see things like the more olive oil I had, or I don't remember out of my head now because it's been a while, but especially olive oil jumped out. Days I had a lot of olive oil, slept better. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, it's like
So,
something that us NDs do, right? Is we'll like get patients between, in my practice, between the first and second visit, I have them track things. Or even if if we have a goal like increase protein, it's useful to just gauge how much protein you're eating and to actually measure it, because um, our intuition is, I believe in our intuition, but sometimes, our sense of how much we're getting or what's affecting our sleep could be off. And when you see the actual numbers, you're like you said, you're like, I can't lie to myself. When I have a big dinner, I don't sleep as well.
yeah. And especially with protein, for example, meat, I have all my meat, or not all my meat, but most of my meat in the morning and at lunchtime. And I noticed if I have a lot of meat at dinner, again, like probably because it takes a while to digest, it doesn't go well with sleep.
Right. So your body's in digestion mode and not in the rest mode. Although rest and digest the same nervous system.
Yeah, it's interesting how that,
Yeah.
like,
But a big part of sleep, like what the digestive system is doing during sleep, is repairing and cleaning itself out, and we get this migrating motor complex sweep where everything gets pushed into the colon, and that can't happen when you're digesting. So it can affect people's sleep. Not everybody notices the same result, but this is the idea with biohacking, is that you're taking your own individual biochemistry and biology and physiology, and then you're tracking certain variables and understanding how they all tie together. And so you could have taken sleep and you could have connected it to exercise and seen how exercise affects your sleep. But you're looking at, two variables. So, and this is just the scientific method where you're the one participant in this study, this N of one study. You're like, okay, so I want to optimize my sleep. So what are the different variables that could affect it? Let's look at diet. And then you just hone in, tweaking the dial, and exactly how can I optimize my sleep using food, and see how that, and if I adjust this one variable, how does that affect the y-axis or the x-axis, or the y-axis, the sleep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also what you said about rest and digest. There's always a threshold dose, I suppose. I mean, if I have, let's say, a quarter pound of meat, it's not going to affect my sleep as much. But when I eat meat, I usually eat a pound or sometimes even more. And a pound of meat at dinner, that's not going to be good for sleep. So.
Yeah, we hung out in Brazil together, and one of your main dietary staples was raw ground beef from a Brazilian butcher, and that was that's really interesting. It tasted good, actually.
Yeah, it's a well-known dish in France and in Belgium. Steak tartare. It's raw ground beef, usually with egg yolks, but I've been mostly using a lot of olive oil with it lately. I feel like it really pops the flavor together with some salt.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, it was, it was tasty. And one of the things that, so we're talking about lifestyle, like diet, exercise, sleep. And this is, I think, the key with biohacking is it's plucking the low-hanging fruit first. I know you've talked about this before, we're going to talk about all these various techniques that you use and other biohackers will use, things like peptides and assessing their genome and doing stool testing. But one of the things that you have recognized is that it's the low-hanging fruit that needs to be
Yes.
addressed first.
Yes. And something that really helped me with that is that I did a genetic test with selfdecode.com. And at the time, around the time that I had the results or before, I was a little bit in a bad mental place. So wouldn't call it depression per se, although a therapist would say it would be like a like
a mild to moderate depression.
Yes, exactly. That's the word. But I would like refer to it more as sadness. And you know, in life, everyone has reasons why they could be sad. There's always things going on in life. But me, I was always like, but these things are not, and me generally, I don't want to say like, oh, I have such an awesome life, a great life. But generally, I was always thinking, it shouldn't affect me this much. Like, why am I sad? There's no real reason to be sad. Most of my people I know are in good health. I'm in good health. Everything's going well. I have a job. I don't really have to worry about anything. There's no reason to be sad. Sure, you can say, oh, you're in a bad relationship, this and that. But even then, I mean, if you can communicate, if you can talk it out, even then, why am I feeling this way? And in the genetic data, it appeared that I had an MTHFR mutation, and sometimes that could be associated with negative thoughts, OCD, depression, all those things. And even though I had the results, like Self-Decode gives you wellness reports to, like, what can you do for, like, how does your DNA look for physical performance? How does your DNA look for cognitive health? How does it look for sleep? Mineral status, vitamin status, etc. So I was interested, especially in cognitive health, and some of the things there, some of the nodes there, they rank pretty high, and they're actually free. For example, sauna. I mean, sauna is not free, but sweating and being in the heat is free. Cold thermogenesis, cold showers and all that, it's free. Make sure you practice daily exercise. All these things are free. And I was like, oh, I already do most of those things, or already know it, so whatever. And that's another thing I noticed. It's not enough to just know something. You actually have to practice it and do it regularly. And I did notice, for example, especially with the sauna practice, I don't have a sauna at home, but I was in Switzerland on I was doing this biohacking thing in a Swiss mountain clinic, and they had saunas. And every morning I would go to the sauna, and I don't like saunas. I don't like sweating. I don't like being hot. And I remember every time I'm in the sauna, I'm not enjoying it. But then an hour and a half later, after the sauna, I feel borderline euphoric. I'm bursting with energy. I'm happy. I'm super talkative. I'm throwing one-liners left and right, making jokes with people, being very sociable. I'm like, wow, this difference is really night and day. And that led me to taking a deep dive in BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's basically the fertilizer for the brain, the fertilizer that makes you generate new neurons. And I noticed that everything that increases BDNF, especially with me, would like boost my happiness, boost my mood. Even on days that I feel great, as soon as I walk out of the house and there's no more roof above my head, I feel even better. It's very subtle sometimes, just a little extra. Just like, it's a beautiful sky. The light is hitting your eyes. I mean, don't look directly into the sunlight, but you get more light around you, more dopamine, more serotonin. I've been rambling on for a while now. I don't
No, you're good.
have any
Yeah, I mean,
questions?
we're going to deep dive into BDNF because I know that's one of the deep dives you took with your own biohacking. And this is something that you noticed. You were like, everything that makes me feel good and just one-ups my mood, even if I'm already feeling good. Everything that makes me feel good and almost puts me in a euphoric state where nothing can bother me. And I know you have this story where you're like, you notice that you would like not take things personally, or it's almost like this mental flip where you're like, wow, I'm really just mentally resilient and strong, and every single thing that attributed to those feelings of mental resilience and strength were
Yes.
things that boosted BDNF. And but the one thing you mentioned, so with self-decode, but we'll go back to BDNF, but with self-decode, you were mentioning MTHFR, and I just want to clarify. So what self-decode is looking at are SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are these little variations in DNA. They're not so much mutations as just our variability in specific genes. And one of the main genes that's been studied is MTHFR, the mother effer gene, which stands for methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, which is the folate pathway. And folate is a methyl donor, and so methylation is just this chemical reaction that does a bunch of different things, from detoxification to part of what makes neurotransmitters. And there's a specific gene within the MTHFR family that's associated with increased risk of depression. And so this is like what I talk about. I have a podcast about nutrients and how it's important to not take synthetic B vitamins. It's better for the vast majority of people. And obviously this is like one-to-one advice that you need to get from a practitioner, but it's just better for most people to take active folate, which is going to act as a methyl donor, than folic acid, which can get stuck in that pathway. And so what was coming up for you was you have MTHFR issues, but then you started to, and so it's things like leafy green vegetables, avoiding folic acid in foods and things like that.
Which made a lot of sense even when I was a child. I mean, sure, everyone likes French fries, potatoes with their meat, but I always noticed that I really enjoyed eating the leafy greens with it. Or as a child growing up, I loved liver. Liver is very abundant in folate. So it's funny how these things can come full circle when you dig deep in your DNA or do other biohacks and then realize it's all coming together, or it's all working on the same pathways. I guess, I mean, the body should know this is what we need. This is what we crave. If we eat this more, we'll function more optimally.
Right. It's like, yeah, like you sensed as a kid, like your taste receptors were even aligned to this genetic variation. You're like, I really like leafy green vegetables. There's something just feels right about consuming them. And I've seen some theories about how people with Mediterranean genes, because people from the Fertile Crescent, whose genetics come from the Fertile Crescent, because there were so many more leafy green vegetables. And there's this theory about genetic real estate, and it's like, it's heavy to carry certain genes. And so the body was just like, well, if we're getting folate from food, we don't necessarily need these to invest in making proteins for this folate pathway that efficiently. But now transplant those genes into North American society, give us fortified grains like rice and wheat that are fortified with folic acid, take away our leafy greens, and now all of a sudden you have a recipe for issues with mental health, like with essentially a deficiency in methylation pathways. Yeah, that's cool. And so let's go back to BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, miracle growth for neurons. This is like basically what makes brain cells or new brain connections in our hippocampus, but everywhere in the brain, mostly in the hippocampus though. And you were mentioning sunlight, and it's like from one moment to the next. Like you said, like a sunny day will boost BDNF on one day, and then a cloudy day will sort of deprive you of that on the next day. And
yes. And I even, other things are like doing breath work, doing breath holds, apnea training. Basically, a lot of these things that boost BDNF, they're not enjoyable in the moment, like holding your breath, doing breath work, and feel a little like exhausting to focus on, like, why am I even doing this? Many times when I was doing things, like I felt like a resistance. I don't want to do it. For example, even this morning, like I don't want to take a cold shower. But then I remember every time I took a cold shower 10 minutes after, I'm like, whew, it gives me a little like cognitive boost, pick me up. Kind of like a cup of coffee. Coffee also boosts BDNF. And we should put it in the show notes. I have a huge file of like probably the biggest file on the internet of all things that boost BDNF.
Yeah, I remember you sent that to me. It was good. Yeah, you had all these connections, and we'll get into all of it because we have time. But yeah, you're mentioning, so basically all these stressors like heat stress, cold stress, fasting, which you haven't mentioned. Even so, good sleep can boost BDNF, but sleep deprivation to a certain extent can also boost BDNF. You were mentioning
Sleep
um,
deprivation will boost DNF, BDNF the same day, but if it's chronic, a few days in a row, then it'll go to hell.
mm,
So
it's
it's good for one day, give you a little boost. Sometimes you get off the plane, didn't sleep well, but you're in a new place and you feel so amped up and ready to go. It could be maybe related to BDNF from not sleeping well on the plane that night.
That's sort of, yeah, it's like all of these stressors. So it's like, so obviously if we think of like stress as this bucket we're carrying around, like if somebody is incredibly chronically stressed, these things are probably just going to overload them, and they're
Yes.
going to experience hormonal dysfunction, like dysfunction in
Yeah.
their stress response essentially. But when you're just kind of applying small stressors, like exercise as well as another one, it's almost like the organism, like the animal of our body is trying to, it's like, oh, we're in a novel environment, right? Because stress is all about, you're trying to figure out ways to cope with a new
Mm-hmm.
situation. And so it's like, oh, we need these extra resources and new neural pathways to understand what we can do maybe to survive.
Yes.
And so this is sort of like built into our genes.
Bas-
But there's these ways we
bas-
can hack that. Mm-hmm.
yeah, basically hormesis. If something in a small dose is good for you, you'll become stronger, but in big dose, you'll die. For
Mm-hmm.
example, going to the gym, working out for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. But if you would work out all day and you're not used to it, it's not really going to, or you're going to run a marathon. The very first person on the planet who ran a marathon ran it, then died. You, do you know the story?
No. Go
So
on.
Marathon is actually a city in Greece, and there was a battle at Marathon, and the general sent the general when they won sent one of their soldiers back to the city to bring the good news that they won the battle. And I think it was 43 kilometers, which is exactly what a marathon is nowadays, or like the exact distance. That's where the distance of a marathon comes from. So the soldier ran the whole distance, arrived at the city, said, I think he said Nike, which means we won or victory, and then he collapsed. He died in the moment.
Mm.
And the same thing with cold thermogenesis. You can have an ice bath for the first time, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. But if you would stay in that ice bath an hour,
Mm.
you will have, what's it called when
Like
someone's,
hypothermia, like essentially nervous
yes,
system shutdown. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
exactly. And same with heat, with sauna. You in there for 30 minutes or 1 hour, everything's good. Stay there and for a full day, you'll have to go to the ER.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's like this idea of just applying a small amount of large doses of stress, but in short spurts, um, in order to encourage the body to start to respond to that kind of stress. So you apply a little bit of cold, or let's say sauna. So you go into the sauna for 20 minutes, high temperature, um, and your body starts to create these proteins, heat shock proteins that are specifically designed to help you deal with hot environments. And you're just doing that for a short amount of time. You're not just moving to Phoenix like you've done. But that's funny because you just told me before we started recording that the reason you're in Phoenix is because you Googled hottest place in the US.
Yes, yes.
And but yeah, it's like you're not like just hanging out in the desert all day long. Like you're just doing sauna for a few minutes, and then receiving some of the benefits. Like your body is triggering these hormetic pathways, which is a lot of what plants offer us. Like we talked about, resveratrol is part of the grape plant's design to deal with arid, hot, dry conditions, and then it transfers that hormetic benefit, that compound, to us to stimulate some of these pathways, to boost antioxidants in our body and things like that. So it's really cool. It's cool how we can like hack our bodies by suffering a little bit.
So true.
Yeah. So what else is in your BDNF handout? Because you had a lot of different things.
Exercise, and especially exercise with blood flow restriction bands. So you can put these on your arms or on your legs. I'm actually wearing some on my legs right now. And they restrict the blood flow. And I believe it's not, they don't know exactly why it works. Oh no, how it works. But um, the reason I dove into this and I discovered that this worked actually was in the middle of my like depression era or bad like mental health era, I went to the gym, and this was really like high pace workout, only 1 minute rest or between sets, sometimes 30 seconds rest between sets. Big movers, big exercise, pull-ups, dips, and then some weights. And I was using the blood flow restriction bands. And after I came out of the gym, I was sit down with this person, and this person was shooting like jokes at me, but you know how like a roast a bit.
Mhm.
And not once I offended. Not once did I even take it personally. In fact, every time, the better the roast was, and the more hurtful, so to speak, the louder I was laughing. It was like, this is a really good joke. This person said, whoa, like today, nothing can push you off. You're like in a super good mood. And I went home, and I remember there's this show as well I used to watch, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and I stopped watching it because I noticed I wasn't laughing anymore. And I didn't want to ruin this good show by just watching it like a zombie and not laughing. So I started watching it as a test, and like within a few seconds I just noticed myself giggling, like I couldn't even control it, like even things that I thought it's not that funny, but then my laugh would pick up, and I was just like shouting out loud, like through, like the neighbors could hear me. And so I actually went searching also on PubMed, and I found a few studies that showed that the blood flow restriction and even exercise in general, but usually not weightlifting, more cardiovascular type of exercise like running, will boost BDNF, or cycling will boost BDNF. But in fact, if you use blood flow restriction bands, and which will also lower maybe the amount of oxygen delivered to the muscles, then BDNF is increased. So that's like a little hack to make uh, weightlifting even more beneficial also for the brain.
Do you know what the mechanism of that is? Like, why does blood flow restriction help with that?
My main guess would be because it restricts oxygen to the blood, and
Mm.
apnea training and breath work in general, holding your breath, will also increase BDNF.
So it's like a slight hypoxia. Yeah, which makes
Exactly,
sense.
that's the
Yeah.
word.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Yeah, because I know most studies, it's like, yeah, it's usually cardiovascular exercise that boosts BDNF. It's like sort of that roaming behavior, like you're hunting, right? There's this association with a little bit of starvation, like fasting can activate that pathway. So anything that just puts the animal under stress. So the main stressors that we would have evolved to combat, any of those things. So usually environmental stressor sort of starts to get our brain to start to innovate to deal with that. And so that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a stripe against being comfortable all the time. If you want to be comfortable all the time, you will never really find true comfort, true happiness, maybe. Depending on your genes, of course. Definitely true in my case.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of our modern society is based around our comfort, right? Not needing to move. So our environment is based around like sort of overcoming our need for movement. We have elevators, we have cars, just hijacking the specific taste that we would go after that would be rare in our environment, like sweet, salt, fat. Things that have been just genetically modified and synthetically altered to get us to go after them. And so it's interesting, that when we start to move into what our body has evolved to deal with, that essentially shaped us and shaped our genetics and shaped our genes, and what our genes have evolved to deal with, it activates these dormant mechanisms that can promote health.
Yep, so true.
That's really cool because, and then we talk about oxytocin. We want to talk about oxytocin.
Definitely.
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So in my genetic snips, for me at least, there's it shows that my oxytocin gene doesn't work as efficient. And over the course of my life, and indeed, people have told me many times I'm not that empathetic. People would tell me, or be standing in front of me, for example, oh, I'm so distraught, or this happened and I'm hurt, or especially when they're mentally hurt, I would just look at them and be like, you look fine, or you're fine. I could just never get into their emotions, like how they were feeling. And
Mm.
Oxytocin is also one thing that can boost BDNF, mostly if it's positive encounters with friends, family, or physical touch. I would also almost never touch people. I'm talking to them, and it would feel weird to touch them. So I don't. How did I? I don't remember how I got to this, but so I started to experiment with the peptide oxytocin itself, which um, and in fact, I was staying with my mom for like a few weeks when I was starting this embarkment on like using oxytocin. And after a few days, or after maybe even a week, I told my mom, "You see anything different in me? You feel anything different?" And she's like, "You're actually really nice.
Mm.
You're very friendly, even when I'm not." And she started laughing. And me and my mom and I have a very interesting relationship. Not always the best, so to speak. And I was a bit like, ah, so she even knows she's acting like, I don't want to say the word here, but she wasn't really acting friendly to me, but I was still friendly to her. And one thing that oxytocin does, it helps with stress resilience
Mm.
and it helps with verbal intelligence.
Mm.
And one thing I did notice with oxytocin, for example, very small, very like subtle example is I'm in a cab, I get in an Uber, and the Uber driver says something, and I'm hearing impaired. I didn't hear what he said. I'm like going in my mind, going about things that I want to do that day. And after a while, I'm like, oh, he said something. Well, he probably asked me where I was going because in Colombia, most Uber drivers will always ask you where you're going to double check you didn't put in the wrong address. And so without asking him, excuse me, I just said, I'm going to this place. And then for a second, my usual behavior would be like, okay, well, maybe it was weird that there was a long pause between his question and my answer, but I don't care. What do I care? I don't know this guy. But now all of a sudden, I'm like, that must feel weird to him. Or maybe he thinks like it's awkward. Or maybe he's like, what is this weirdo sitting next to me in my Uber? And all of a sudden, I felt this urge to explain to him or to tell to him, like, or just say it out loud. And I said, well, that was a long, awkward silence. Huh, maybe I need some more sleep tonight. And we both started laughing. Like, I made a little joke. The ice was broken. Without oxytocin, that it would have never have happened. That would have just been. And that's another thing I noticed with oxytocin, me being more empathetic. I'm also empathetic enough that I want to explain myself. And then I
Mm.
have the energy to explain myself verbally. And instead of thinking like, ah, that takes too much effort to, like, for example, to my employees to explain why I want it done this way. All of a sudden with oxytocin, it's much easier to do. And so, for example, my mom would say, it's like, oh, you don't have to change for anyone. You're fine the way you are. I'm like, maybe I don't, but life is much more enjoyable this way.
Mm.
I have more energy to talk. I explain myself. People are connecting with me more. We're laughing more, both me and the other person. So why would I not use it? Although I do have to say, oxytocin is very potent, very powerful. And for these like 3 weeks on end, I was doing it very regularly. I would do it after a workout because it enhances muscle recovery. And I would do it before sleep also because it enhances sleep. And after 3 weeks, I really started to understand what people meant with spirituality, and we're all humans, we're all connected.
Mm.
And I actually started to become a little like overwhelming. And I was like, wow, this is really potent. I shouldn't like play with it too much. So then I backed off. And another instance I had, I don't know if it was related to oxytocin, but I think it was. I remember something I did that was like wrong or uncalled for. I was like mean to a person. And not just that I was mean, I was also in my mind, I was going like, yeah, it's good. Are you hurt? Good. And actually, this person is a good friend to me. So all of a sudden, I was like, why am I being mean to this person? It makes no sense. And so months later, I did some oxytocin. I remember this moment, and for like almost an hour, I had so much difficulty to forgive myself, to push it outside of my head, to be like, well, this has passed. I already apologized. Actually, at the time, I didn't apologize. I did apologize now. So maybe it was me telling myself, well, you know, you did this and it was wrong. And you still haven't apologized for it. Maybe that's what was happening.
Mm.
So, yeah.
It's so interesting. Like, so, I mean, oxytocin, just to give some background, it's essentially like the love hormone. It's associated. So it's actually increased for women during childbirth. It helps with uterine contraction to help expel the baby during childbirth. And then it's about bonding and connection. And so it's typically women have more oxytocin and men have more vasopressin, and they're sort of, they work in opposition to one another. And so it's essentially like a very female hormone. It's about connections, about social interaction. Like you mentioned, smoothing over awkward social moments. Whereas before you'd be like, oh yeah, I can kind of sense that it was awkward, but I'm not going to put myself too much in the cab driver's head to really feel like I need to kind of like, he can think whatever he wants of me.
Yes.
There was this natural impulse to actually smooth that over and then connect with him just for the sake of connection, just because it became more potent to you and more salient in terms of like what you actually wanted from the experience. And then you're also speaking of almost this guilt or shame, because that's a big part of seeing ourselves in someone else's eyes, and this idea of like, oh, I did wrong to this person, or I was in this vindictive place, or I was seeing that person as an other. And now that I see that person as a part of myself, I'm actually experiencing hurt for hurting myself.
Yes.
And then you're also talking about this, almost this ego dissolution, where you're like, I am overwhelmed by the idea that we're all this interconnected entity, and maybe we're not even individual people, and I'm starting to lose my individuality, and that's freaking me out. So I need to stop oxytocin. But I also want to just say one thing about oxytocin is it's a peptide, and we'll talk more about different peptides. So peptides are not approved for clinical use, but they're protein complexes, so they're like protein strings that naturally occur in the body, and there's many of them that a lot of them are active in the brain. And oxytocin, and so insulin is one. So a type 1 diabetic that injects himself with insulin is injecting a peptide. So in that sense, that particular peptide is approved for clinical use. But oxytocin can be injected and it can be snorted, and it will actually just raise your body's levels artificially of oxytocin. And so, you know, you can get oxytocin through naturally through like connecting with somebody, skin to skin touch, even touching one's own body. There's like these self-compassion practices you can do. But in your case, you had done this genetic test looking at your SNPs, and you don't naturally produce that much oxytocin. Like your gene is not that efficient. And then you were sort of looking back through your life like, yeah, I can see the ways in which I may have not been making as much oxytocin, like, you know, like you're like, I'm kind of an a-hole in some regard.
Yes.
But then there's also this verbal acuity that comes from it, which makes a lot of sense because our social interactions are all about verbalizing to connect and communicate. And that's this idea of like women gathering with the kids with the papooses on their back and like weaving baskets and just sort of hashing out problems and, you know, discussing things, you know, and so it's very interesting.
Actually, a very interesting fact also about oxytocin, because a lot of people, even doctors, will go like, oh, that's a female hormone, or you're going to give childbirth, why would you use that? But for example, people that are in the military, or people that work out together or do martial arts together. In fact, in the military, when men go through hardship together and they sing together, singing increases oxytocin. They sing together, they fight together, they touch each other also by fighting and hitting each other. Oxytocin is raised, and in fact, they've shown like humans will be able to coordinate their group actions better to like hunt either other humans, which is war, or to hunt other animals. So without speaking, you can read your friend's body language, and you actually become more efficient at having war with like threats, with enemies, with other animals. And I just thought that's for the people who think it's just a female hormone. It's just much more than that. It makes sure that the tribe keeps intact and everyone helps to defend the tribe. And you can also, for example, when you just meet people, strangers, and you have an adventure with them, for example, a dog attacks you and you fight off the dog together, even though you're both strangers, this event will increase oxytocin so much that now you have your bond is a little tighter, or you can go shoot guns together, even if you're not in the military. Like if you're going on a date, it could help you if you actually do something exciting, not just exciting for excitement's sake, but do something that's really like an adventure, like go on a hike. Sharing, trusting people, and being trusted also increases oxytocin. So it's very well, what I like about it is, in an essence, it's free. You don't really have to use the peptide itself. But I mean, what I liked about using the peptide is once I did, I saw what was possible. I saw how I could be when oxytocin was at a good level. So even now, when I don't use oxytocin, I can think like, oh, this isn't right. This isn't how people should behave, or I should interact with other people. What would oxytocin Evo do, so to speak? And I can smooth things over.
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? It's like it gives you this baseline to return to, where it's like, I know what's possible. Like you said, like it's like kind of cleaning grease off a window or dirt off a window pane. Like I now know what it's like to see clearly through this window, and I can see when things are starting to kind of cloud over it. And so it's time for me to sort of up my oxytocin game in terms of finding people I can trust going on. I wonder what's the mechanism behind the stress? Like, is it stress itself that boosts oxytocin? Is it the adrenaline, or do you know what causes that?
No.
Mm-hmm.
No. What I did find interesting, if I'm not mistaken, but we'll have to double check this. I think both oxytocin and BDNF might use or share the same receptor. So,
right.
but
You were saying that, yeah,
especially,
like,
actually, a lot of things that are more like female specific, they're not as well researched in science, because for scientists it's very difficult to work with controls because of female hormones fluctuating during the month, etc. So, and it's just cheaper to do studies with men only. So I believe a lot of things that are seen in the past as being very feminine haven't been researched that well yet.
That's interesting. Yeah, I know that there's I had a friend, this is a real aside, but I had a friend that would do med studies, and I considered it at one point because I wanted to make money to put myself through school, and a lot of the criteria to participate in the studies was that you had to be postmenopausal or a man, because of the added variable of the different hormonal states and things. So that's interesting. Yeah. And it's interesting because actually yesterday I was talking with Erica in episode 9. We were discussing this idea of like the female brain is sort of designed for lateral pathways, and the male brain is more about linear pathways. And like it's like the hunter versus the gatherer. And so oxytocin is a lot, and BDNF are a lot about this lateralization of different brain pathways to try and figure out. It's literally like a bypass. Like, this is how I would normally do things this way, A to B. And BDNF is like, well, maybe we can go from A to C to B if the A to B pathway is blocked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is very cool. Yeah. What other so you've been experimenting with various peptides. What are some other ones that you've been doing that are part of your biohacking regime?
One was BPC 157, which is, I would consider a good entry-level peptide, especially if you're if you're battling an injury. Like I would sometimes, again, my shoulder sometimes hurt, and I've used BPC, and sometimes my shoulder would hurt for weeks or months. And with BPC 157, like maybe within a week and a half or two, like within a week and a half, it's gone, like completely gone, not even distinguishable anymore. And BPC is actually a compound that is made in the stomach, and is very important also for gut health. Another one which was kind of interesting, and it was a bit of an experiment, was melanotan 2. It's mostly famous for use in the bodybuilding world because it can give you a tan much faster than just being in the sun. But it's actually also been researched as a substance that might prevent skin cancer or protect against the sun again. And there's some research that it might be beneficial for autism. And just as the sun is, in fact, the sun also I would have to double check, but I think like bright light and sun exposure in general increases BDNF and oxytocin. But melanotan too, so what it does is it stimulates the melanocortin receptors. A lot of people think when sunshine is all about vitamin D, but there's so much more. There's melanocytes receptors in the skin, and all these are, when these are stimulated, they can enhance libido, they can enhance fat loss, they um, yeah, they protect you against the sun by tanning, um, and they can suppress appetite. I mean, in the summer, people eat less. And the good thing about melanotan too is instead of being in the sun for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours to get your, so to speak, sunshine fix, with melanotan you could do it in 20, 30 minutes. And yeah, at first I didn't even know about the libido enhancing effects, but then I was using very small doses. And I would suggest everyone who wants to try would start with the smallest dose because it's so potent. And after a few weeks, I didn't notice, for example, that my sexual experience was enhanced. And in fact, I was much more giving. With instead of just worrying about me and thinking about me, I was much more thinking about, is she having a good time? Does she enjoy this? What else can I do? And it kind of, the best way to describe it, it increased my sexual hunger. Like before, I'll be like, well, not that I'm bored, but like, oh, I want to do something else now. And now with the melanotan tuna, it was like I could go on forever. It seemed like just it was so not interesting is not the word, but it was so exciting in a way that, yeah, this is amazing. This is wonderful. Let's just keep doing this.
It's interesting. Do you know if that is effective in women as well?
Yes. Well, melanotan 2 might not be, although I've found some reports about women who do notice a difference. It might be very subtle, especially in the beginning. But the first few times that they tested melanotan 2 on humans, they noticed like that everyone who got it, all of a sudden, or almost everyone, I got an erection, all the men. And they've pinpointed it to one of the downstream metabolites of melanotan 2 as PT141. And that substance indeed does work in women. I think it's in fact the only aphrodisiac that works for women. What was I going to say? Yes, and in fact, it's so potent and it works so well that something happened in the legal realm in the USA. It was not approved or something. And usually when things are not approved, they are forgotten. And that's it, because all these researchers spend time and money investigating this and they don't want to share it. But these researchers were like, this is so potent, this is so efficient, the world needs to know about this. And they put all the research for free online. So everything is freely available for everyone. There's no patent on it, I think.
Wow. That's so cool. Yeah, because I think, I mean, low libido is something that's a sort of insidious issue among women, among some men, some male patients that I have as well, and there's different reasons for that, hormonal imbalances, stress, things like that. But it's very interesting. And it's like, so you said, anything that melanotan works on, essentially the sun is also affecting. Yes. So it's like any benefit, right? Like any benefit you get from the sun, you're going to get from injecting you can also, again, a nasal spray of melanotan.
And in fact, I've seen some, I mean, this is just internet N=1 data anecdotes. There's people saying that if you do it intranasally, it will work more on the brain with the mood boosting effects and the appetite suppressing effects, etc., and less on the skin. So a way to not to become too dark or to tan too much could be to use it intranasally.
And then one of the things, go ahead.
Just I don't know if I mentioned this before, but melanotan 2 has also been tested to help with autism. And
right. Well, do you know the mechanism of that? Like, what does it boost in autism, or how does it work in that way?
Well, I mean, I don't want to seem like a broken record, but in general, sunlight, sun exposure, you got dopamine, definitely got dopamine, oxytocin also, and then BDNF. It's never one thing. It's like so many things working together, serotonin. Yeah. But melanotan 2 and especially PT141 work on the dopamine pathways for sure.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you're going to get this mood boosting effect, this boost in motivation. Yeah, I mean, the sun does so much, right? And I think there's this focus on vitamin D, but there's this huge effect of our circadian rhythms for all of these different things in our bodies. And so we know that, like, if you take someone who's sunlight deprived and you just give them vitamin D, I think there's studies in multiple sclerosis. It's like, yes, people with MS tend to have lower D levels, but just replacing their D isn't necessarily reversing their symptoms. It has a lot to do with sunlight. And I think, so, one of the things I learned in school was that beta carotene is a biomarker of vegetable intake. So supplementing with beta carotene is not necessarily going to provide these positive outcomes in your health. But we see these correlations with low health markers, or like low health status and low beta carotene, and like better health status and higher levels of beta carotene in the blood. So in this way, it's a biomarker, but it's not the beta carotene specifically that's changing someone's health status. And we have lots of studies on vitamin D, and vitamin D is really important, but in many ways, it may also be a biomarker for physical activity, which mostly is done outside, and sunlight exposure. And so we have to be really careful when we're looking at correlations with vitamin D, because is it the vitamin D specifically, which is very important? It's a hormone in the body, it needs to do a lot of different things. Or is it the sunlight, right? And if,
And I'm always looking, how did we evolve, like ancestrally? Since the agricultural revolution, we've been not traveling like nomads anymore. We haven't been in the sun all day or outside all day. I mean, the amount of lux or light in your house is like being in a cave, sometimes worse. Even if you use strong artificial lights, when you go outside, it's over 11,000 lux, even on a cloudy day, if you just look at the sky, even if there are clouds present. So yeah, a lot of people, it's not enough knowing the sun is good for you or light is good for you. You actually need to go outside as well and actually be around just being inside and looking through the window outside. It's a beautiful day, or sitting on the patio, it's not the same. I mean, look where I am. I'm outside, the roof is here, and I'm next to the house and the shade, of course. But yeah, that's what I mean. There's no need, especially at first. You don't have to go get all the supplements, get all the beta carotene, all the peptides. You can just do all these things, move a lot, stand a lot. I'm standing up right now. I have the camera right here. I'm not sitting down. And the beginning, especially, I mean, it's going to be hormesis. It's not going to be easy, but you increase your exposure, you increase these things. After a while, it becomes easy, and life becomes so much more comfortable or bearable, even physical and emotional or psychological stressors. And yeah, definitely worth a path worth partaking, no, pursuing, something worth pursuing.
Right. It's like you start to crave it in a sense. It's when you know what baseline you're returning to, you start to feel this craving for movement, or whether it be fasting or sauna, you're sort of like, oh, it's been a while since I've had, cold therapy. I'm kind of craving it in a way. It's not comfortable. I don't always want it, but there's something that, like, you're sort of craving that outcome afterwards, the benefit that you get from it. And like sunlight is huge. I mean, this is a big thing, right? It's like if you think of, again, it's back to the low hanging fruit. Like you said, if you think of us as, like, if you think of what a plant needs to be healthy, we're the same way. And so, yeah, you can take all the supplements, you can go on whatever specific diet, but if you're not getting the sunlight, the sleep, the movement, the water, the fresh air, it's, can we ever achieve optimal health without those basic foundational necessities?
It's going to be definitely more difficult, and you'll spend a lot more money.
Yeah, it's a lot of peptides you got to inject to overcome your need for the baseline health factors. And so, I mean, one of the things too is with the peptides, like any of the peptides that you're using right now, or that you've experimented with.
Sometimes I use C-Max, which is supposed to be nootropic. It's not something I actually feel. Again, it's maybe subtle, maybe just smoother thinking, smoother working. Yeah, that's
yeah. I know that was something you were using to try and up your surf game in Brazil.
Yes.
Was it
And
working?
I feel that it worked, but I mean, again, there's so many variables. Before Brazil, I definitely was out in the sunshine more, which increases dopamine, and dopamine has an effect on balance. So my
Mm,
balance would be better. I do feel like normally to pick up where I left off 2 years before, it would have taken me longer. And now I feel with the C-Max, it was easier to pick it up faster to get back to where it was before. Because if you don't do something, especially me, anything that's coordination or balance, if I don't do it for 2 years, I'm going to be almost exactly where I was before.
mm. Right. CMAX is one of those BDNF boosters as a peptide.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and again, yeah, peptides are not they're not available for clinical use, so nobody is recommending them. A lot of them are just for research purposes at this point. But there's a lot of biohackers that are using these things because, again, biohacking is about that tweak, and biohacking involves things like that. Like the keto diet and fasting are big in the biohacking world. So there's these little like this, what are the ways that we can optimize that last 10% of health. Psychedelics as well. Microdosing is a big biohacking technique. Um, yeah. And then there's lots of gadgets as well. And, different things like I think, what's the one that you use for your ears that helps regulate circadian rhythms?
The human's charger.
All right. Do you use that?
Usually when I travel and I want to reset my circadian rhythm and like on the new clock or wherever I land, then I'll put it in the morning as soon as I wake up.
Mm.
Um, Sometimes, actually, lately I haven't been using it that much, but sometimes think like, oh, I would want a coffee, or there's no time for coffee, or I don't want a coffee that day because I do a lot of like non-coffee days,
Mm.
2 days on, 3 days off, etc. Then I'll use the human charger instead.
Mm. Mm. So
And
basically, yeah.
it shines the light into your ears
Mm.
because there used to be other devices that would shine the light in your eyes, but it could actually give you retina damage. And there's photoreceptors in the ears as well, and all over your skin, but ears, eyes. So they came up with the human charger.
Mm. Yeah, it looks like a little iPod with earphones, but they don't produce sound. They just shine blue light into the ears. It sort of regulates circadian rhythm. So it's useful for, transatlantic flights, this kind of thing, to help re-regulate the circadian rhythms, like melatonin or sun exposure might do. It's very
In fact,
interesting.
one that I like the most is I can't think of the name. Oh, the V light. The V light, the one that just shine. There's two. There's one that goes on your head, and there's one that just shines on your nose, a red light, and your like nose lights up like a clown when you use it. Um, I noticed a long time, even before I heard it on a podcast. But if you use it right before sleep, or actually you go to bed, you lay in bed, you put it in, I'll go on for 25 minutes. I noticed with the Aura Ring that whenever I would use it, I would have like maybe 20, sometimes 30 extra minutes of REM sleep.
Uh,
So that's a really nice one. I like that.
yeah,
It's
so, yeah.
supposed to. You could use it before studying as well. It's supposed to enhance your brain function.
Mm.
You could use it before a workout. It's a vasodilator. It dilates your blood vessels. So,
Mm.
but I only use it actually before I go to sleep, or
Mm.
sometimes in the mornings when I think of it. I don't always think of these things, and I don't always use them. Just like the big low hanging fruit first, and sometimes like, oh, I see it right there. Might
Mm.
as well use it. You can use it up to twice a day.
Mm.
So.
What other things have you found help your sleep? Because I know you have a whole sleep regime.
Um, Lately I've been working. I'm doing the ketogenic diet right now, and one thing I've noticed is that my heart rate is a little higher than usually. Usually it's 46 beats per minute, which a lot of people say is very low,
Mm.
and now it's around the 52, 55 beats per minute. And I've been, let's say, sleeping a little less,
Mm.
but I still feel great. I don't know if it's because I need less sleep because I'm not consuming as much carbohydrates as I usually do, or what it is. But so I still want as much sleep as I can get. So lately I've been using tryptophan, which is a supplement, one gram of tryptophan before bed. I also use taurine mostly to help. break down the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth, which is everywhere.
Mm.
Taurine will help you. Taurine will help with radiation. You can also use it while flying
Mm.
to help with the cosmic radiation. And glycine. Nowadays, we eat a lot of muscle meat, which is a lot of methionine. And back in the day, we would eat the animal nose to tail, which means the skin, the joints, the connective tissue, which has a lot of glycine. So I use glycine with that. And for a lot of people, 3 grams of glycine before bed will increase their deep sleep. My
Mm.
deep sleep is really good. It's pretty much always around to 2 hours a night. The thing that could use most help is REM, because once I wake up, I'm usually awake and ready to go. So the R ring showed me, which that the longer I stay in bed, actually the more REM sleep I have. So what I need to do is, even though I wake up, instead of like, okay, I'm ready to go, let's go, turn around and just dream about something else, or like daydream, and then sometimes you fall asleep again, as if you're like fooling your mind. Oh, we're dreaming, we're sleeping, and then you actually start to sleep again for some extra REM.
Because REM happens sort of in the earlier morning, the later
Exactly.
part of sleep. Yeah. And so what you're talking about are amino acids. So taurine, which tends to boost GABA, which is a relaxing neurotransmitter. And then you're talking about how it can also affect, help protect against radiation. And glycine, which is an amino acid as well, found in collagen. It's one of the main amino acids in collagen, which is found in connective tissue of animals. And glycine in and of itself is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it calms the brain, also regulates blood sugar, and it's involved in detox pathways.
Sometimes I have it with a meal. If I have a lot of carbs, I throw in some glycine.
Yeah, and it's a great, it has a little bit of a sweet taste, so people can use it as a sugar substitute. And then what was the other one you talked about? Oh, tryptophan. So tryptophan is actually an essential amino acid that plant-based individuals need to watch that they're getting, because it's in poultry and in eggs typically. And we don't make it in our bodies on our own. So we need to get it from food, and it's converted into 5-HTP, which is then converted to serotonin, which is then converted to melatonin. And so it's one of those things that if you, it's called precursor loading, I believe. And so, yeah, if you provide your brain and body with a high dose of the precursor amino acid, you can push the pathway to get more of the end product, like serotonin, melatonin. It's actually something my vet recommended that I give Coco to help him sleep.
Oh. Yeah, why not?
So just give him turkey breast, which is high in tryptophan's favorite food. So yeah. But that's, yeah, so you'll do some amino acid loading to help you sleep, and then you're noticing, yeah, those tweaks are effective in getting more deep sleep.
And other things that I sometimes use is a passion flower tea, chamomile tea. These are all known to enhance sleep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like nervine herbs that boost GABA typically in the brain. And passion flower is actually great because you don't get a hangover effect from it. So valerian, if you wake up in the middle of the night, like you do that, you have that 2 to 4 a.m. wake up that a lot of people get, and you take something like valerian at that time, you might feel groggy because the effects are prolonged. You get that kind of hangover, but passion flower doesn't give you that. So you can take passion flower as needed if you wake up. It's kind of good to know.
Okay.
Not medical advice, though. This is just educational purposes only. And oh man, there was something else I wanted to ask. Oh, I want to talk about Viome. So I want to talk about gut testing, because I know this is like a new layer you've added, is getting your stool tested, your microbiome tested.
I've done it very recently, and then they give you recommendations based on your stool, like what your optimal diet could be. And actually, I've found a lot of correlations or similarities, better said, similarities with the DNA testing from Self-Decode and the recommendations that they give. Again, a lot of foods that are high in resveratrol, foods that are high in quercetin. My superfoods are, for example, olive oil, olives, lamb, and ghee also, to increase butyrate, which butyrate also increases BDNF, dopamine. I just recently started, so I can't really comment on it much, but just the fact that I saw in my gut the same things emphasized as in the DNA test tells me like, okay, this is all making sense. Everything's coming together.
Mm.
That's and one thing I would suggest also for people who do actually the DNA testing to get to get all the reports. And then I went through my reports and I just looked which thing is recommended the most, which
Mm.
are my personal low hanging fruit. If I do this, I'll have the most impact. So those things that come up, those are my non-negotiables, and for someone else they could be different.
It's really cool. It's
So
like you establish your own health plan based on the data that you found. And I think you do, was it 23andMe, and then you ran it through a specific
yeah,
interpreter?
then I uploaded the data to Self Decode, but in Self Decode, in fact, also have their own DNA testing, and their terms and conditions are way more rigid than 23andMe. If
Mm.
you do 23andMe, it will be shared
Mm.
with, I don't know, pharmaceutical companies or this and that, or people you might not people, but companies you might not want to know. Self Decode has a very rigid privacy policy.
Mm.
So I would suggest people to go to skip 23andMe and just go straight to Self Decode. And
Mm.
there's another one now called Chronomics.
Mm.
I just ordered it 2 weeks ago. And Chronomics does not just DNA testing, but also epigenetic testing. So
Mm.
they will see how your genes are switched on and off through your lifestyle. And
Mm.
the way they explain it is you'll have like like a twin. They'll make a virtual twin,
Mm.
and then if you do these things, you will have a better health outcome down the line. You'll actually improve your body. Well, I haven't dove into that yet, but there's actually a really good discount now, but people would have to go to the Superhuman Radio podcast to find it. And
Mm.
usually it's I think the regular price is $1,000 or $1,200, and now it's only $290 or
Mm.
$300. Only available to Superhuman Radio podcast listeners.
Mm.
Sorry,
Okay.
Talia.
I got to start getting on that and listening. But yeah, so people can check that out. We'll put links to the different things you talked about, Self Decode, Superhuman Radio, in the show notes and the description of this episode. But that's very interesting. So it's giving you sort of two paths. Like you're at a fork in the road, and if you go down this road, these are your health outcomes. If you go down this road, this is the hell that you
Exactly.
potentially could enter. And that's very interesting.
Because in my genetic snips, it said, oh, you could become a diabetic, you probably battle with overweight, but I don't. And I just think my lifestyle has been able to counteract that. So it's not all about genetics. And their genetics, you can see your risk markers. But what a lot of people should understand, or what I would wish the medical orthodoxy would understand, you can influence your health outcomes so much just with lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
So up to the fact that you don't have to worry about it. I mean, it shows over and over again genetic twins, and they have totally different outcomes health-wise because they have different lives.
Like absolutely, like genes aren't everything. Like they can help guide us in terms of what do you need. But actually, the first time I ever did genomic testing, I think it was when I just graduated. There was a new company that came out that that tested your SNPs, and what I found was it wasn't things that I didn't know. It was actually very interesting. So it was things like, you don't really have many SNPs that are going to put you at risk of cardiovascular disease. And I was like, well, in my family, we don't really have much cardiovascular disease. But then there were other things like liver enzymes that were working more slowly. Like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I'm prone to things like migraines or, skin issues, just various things that you kind of already know about your health, which is very interesting. So we can kind of extrapolate just based on what we've been dealing with, our family history, but it's nice to see your SNPs and then the recommendations, then be able to have a strategic plan to follow.
Yes, especially for me, seeing it in black and white really pushed me over, and like, this is non-negotiable. This needs to happen every day.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's like you
then,
said.
and over time, it accumulates in a positive sense. Like over the last year, I've totally turned my life around, coming from a really deep, dark place mentally, and now feeling great every single day. And if something happens in my life now, or I get some bad news or something stressful, it'll take me 5, 10, 15 minutes. The worst case, 1 hour to like get over it mentally.
Mm.
And back in the day, or like last year, it would take me the whole day or weeks, and like have recurring thoughts, be obsessive about things. Is this way is the only way. Now being much more flexible and like my thinking.
This is yeah, this is why I wanted to interview you, because it's I think so interesting in that you've noticed this 180 turnaround. So you went from this almost like dysthymia. It's like it wasn't quite depression, but it was generalized sadness and things that we could just attribute to, oh, this is the way I am, you know, or this is based on my circumstances. Like I'm in a bad relationship, I need to change it. And then by doing these things, and some of these things are like top tier biohacking, like the peptides, but a lot of these things are sunlight, you know, exercise, hot cold therapy, stuff that anyone can do, right? Anyone can sort of run a hot bath and get some heat therapy. And you notice this mental resilience that kicked in as if you're tapping into a different personality. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm still the same person, but now I have like the mental tools to be the person that I want to be. And you don't want to be sad. You don't want to be stuck in a rut. Like, why am I so obsessive about this happening, or having things my way? And I think I'll just tell a little story. And I was in Miami, and my grandfather had been sick for a while. And I get a phone call, and my mom said that he passed away. And the funny thing is, within about 5 minutes of having that phone call, I'm driving and I have like a small accident. It's like already showing that mentally, even though I'm like fine, I'm driving, I'm still already like dealing with the stress. Nothing major, everyone's fine. It was just like material damage. And over the course of the next week, I bought my ticket to go back to Belgium to attend the funeral. Over the next week, we actually had planned with my girlfriend. My girlfriend at the time. I had planned to go to all these amusement parks in Miami. And I remember being out all day in the sun, and I was actually eating very little, which is fasting. We were doing intermittent fasting, which we haven't really gotten into. I was also eating a lot of pistachios, a lot of leafy greens when I did eat, sometimes only one meal a day, and a lot of salmon. And after a few days, like, you know what's interesting? I'm really close to my grandfather, but I don't feel that sad. I don't feel like I'm hurting. And when my cousin died years ago, I was a mental mess, miserable. I think and I was actually closer to my grandfather than to this cousin. My grandfather used to raise me. I lived at his house for a couple of years by my grandparents, both of them. And but we attributed it to, oh, maybe the adrenaline from the amusement park and the rides, but I thought it was kind of like a weird explanation.
Mm.
Then we went to Belgium, and in Belgium every single day I started feeling worse, with the total deep point being the funeral, the day of the funeral, crying a lot. And I know it's not a competition, but I always felt like I was crying more than some other people, like some other cousins in my family. Or I don't know, not crying more maybe, but also I felt like I was dealing with it much more painfully, like I was in more pain, so to speak. And it went on, and then I had to go back to Miami for work after the funeral, pretty much the day after, and it deteriorated even more. And the whole day, like nonstop, I could hear the funeral song playing in my head, and every single time I thought of, and I was constantly thinking about my grandfather. Every time I thought about him, I was crying. Like I had the difficulty speaking to other people. Sometimes I would just burst crying in the middle of the conversation. But then all of a sudden, about a week later, something happened. And in the meantime, every single day I walked out to the pool. I sat by the pool, not in the sunshine, but in the shade. And I would watch the summaries of the World Cup goals at the time. And I would eat my pistachios, eat my arugula, have my salmon. And the fourth day, I notice I'm walking around and I just start giggling over something simple, insignificant. Like, oh, this is weird. I haven't laughed in at least 10 days or weeks. Even when I was at the amusement parks with my ex-girlfriend at the time, we weren't really laughing already. We weren't really that wasn't really the type of relationship we had. It wasn't really a good relationship, but I digress. So that same day, I giggled not once, but 3 times. I'm like, something's going on. Did I stop thinking about my grandfather? And I realized, no, I'm still thinking about him a lot. And the funeral song is still playing. So, but it doesn't hurt. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. This is great. I can commemorate my grandfather. I can remember him without being in pain. I
Mm.
can laugh about the good times we had and all the beautiful memories. And this is so much more enjoyable.
Mm.
And so that moment and some other moments in my life where I felt better or like really good above baseline really made me dive deeper in mental health. And at the time I thought, oh, fish oil or salmon is the holy grail. But it wouldn't work all the time, no matter
Mm.
how big of a dose I took. So then I started again with the multifaceted approach. It's many different things all working together in the perfect storm, you know?
Mm. Like the stacking effect.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Mm.
So how did I get to this
This change in
story?
mood and how you
Yeah.
noticed circumstances would affect, well,
Mm,
specific stacking protocols would affect it versus the circumstance.
mm. So yeah, my mental resilience was way higher, just as it is now, really good. And in fact, this is there are studies that show when people are depressed, they think everything's an attack against them. Like when I was younger, like in my teens, I would walk down the street, and if some people are laughing, I would sometimes think, and this is how depressed people think, are they laughing at me?
Mm.
Are they talking about me? But now, when I'm happy, or in general, when I'm happy and I see people laughing, I also laugh. I'm like, huh, they're having a good time. I'm having a good time. Well, life is great.
Mm.
So, and when people actually crack jokes or they're roasting each other, when I was in a and sometimes you don't realize. But so when people roast each other or roast me or give like underhanded comment, like a backstabbing comment, but sometimes it's not a backstabbing comment, it's just a joke.
Mm.
But when you're in a bad place, you're like, oh, I feel offended. Why would you say that? And I remember this joke that happened last year, and it really like affected me. And just this week, I thought about that joke, and I started laughing. But it's such a good joke,
Mm.
and it wasn't even directed at me. It was directed at someone else, but I took it personally. And this is one of my theories now that maybe a lot of comedians say that like political correctness, people are upset faster. They're asked, "Oh, that joke offended me. You need to apologize." I think a lot of it has to do with the overall decline in mental health all over the world. So,
And it can definitely cycle. Like, I think I mean, the main symptoms of depression is this lack of self-esteem. There's this stigmatization that, part of how mental health is just stigmatized generally, or we feel this internal stigmatization and this internalized sense of shame. And then you feel that you interject that when you hear people laughing. You were like, are they laughing at me? Because everything sort of becomes about, our failings and this kind of thing. And then that just flips. I've heard this with microdosing, actually. It's interesting. Like, people would say, the amygdala doesn't get activated in the face of stressful circumstances, such as like a face that shows. So normally, if you see an angry face or a face that shows disgust, we'll feel threatened. And because it's about us, right? It's about this interaction between us and that other person. And so, oh, they're angry at me. And so then our amygdala starts to get activated and we start to get ready to respond. But when we sort of change these serotonin pathways, and so, microdosing psychedelics potentially is one of those ways that can happen. But, these other things that you're talking about are also going to be changing your serotonin system if they're impacting your mood. We stop personalizing those facial expressions, and we stop making it about us. And it's just this automatic thing that happens. It's not an active thing we have to do necessarily. It's like you said, you remember that joke and you're like, oh, that's a hilarious joke. It's not about me. Whereas before you were personalizing it.
yes, yep. Well, when you're in a bad place, you take everything in a negative way, or a lot of things at least.
Hmm.
And to come back to psychedelics, for example, I've done a little bit of microdosing, but never continuously, mostly because I just forget about it. And with psychedelics, for me, the changes are so subtle that I was like, oh, does it really work? Some days I feel like yes, other days nothing. And also, I travel so much, not now, right now, of course, due to the lockdowns, but I travel so much, I can't be traveling over international borders with illegal substances. So
Mm.
that's, and everything's going great the way I'm doing now. So I don't want, again, people to think, oh, peptides, psychedelics,
Mm.
it's a must have. There's so much easier ways, really, or more legal ways to do
Mm.
it.
Which this is why, yeah, again, why I wanted to interview you, because I think that, and I've spoken about this before, where we're always looking for that magic bullet, right? It's like, oh, if I inject this peptide, it's going to make this giant change. And I think that that can be true. And sometimes it's really nice to have this one thing that has powerful, far-reaching effects. But I mean, we always talk about first filling in the foundational gaps, like sealing the foundational cracks in our
Yes.
lifestyle. And it's like, I mean, yeah, you can do melanotan instead of getting sunlight, but it's probably a lot better to just put ourselves in an environment that our body is used to evolving in if we can.
Yeah. And for example, remember when we were in Brazil, there was this guy who was in distress and he asked for some tips. And I mean, the main tips would be like, get some good sleep, but we're at a festival, music never stops and almost nobody ever sleeps. But okay, let's do some breathing exercise. Let's drop down and do 20 push-ups right here. We don't need psychedelics, or we don't need peptides to make us feel better instantly. And how do you feel now? It's like, oh yeah, better. There you go. It's free.
Right. I remember that. He's like, oh yeah, I'm awesome now. You're like, but what he really wanted was like, put me on some supplements because I want
Yeah.
to, nobody really wants to hear, well, do some push-ups, but I mean, it is like, that's the point, right? Is that it is a lot of the time about exercise. It's the thing that we kind of know in the back of our mind we should be doing, but we need to be convinced. And I think, like you said, and we all have our different our own personalities, right? So like in your case, what it sounds like is you really like to, okay, here's your black or white strategy. So it came down from Dan the Man. It came from Dan the Man. It started with Dan the Man when you were 27. He was literally like, you want big arms? Follow this protocol. And you're like, okay, no questions asked. I'm in. I'm just going to dedicate myself to this protocol and take away that decision-making element of it. I'm just going to submit myself to Dan the Man, trust him and go. And it's now with self-decode. Okay, this is based off of my own genetics, so it makes sense. It's based off of science. I'm gonna just try it and see what happens, and then kind of check in again in a few months and see how I feel. And then you start noticing these effects.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is great, Ivo. I mean, there's a lot of things we could keep talking about. Like we could really get into Viome. I mean, Viome basically is just a microbiome test, looks at stool. There's many different tests that can look at, what's going on in your poop. And Viome, there's some criticism against it, but some of my patients have had it tested. And one of the things that's useful, it's very sensitive because it's a PCR test, so polymerase chain reaction, which is just looking at which amplifies DNA. So it's looking at all of the DNA in your stool. So some of that could be clinically relevant, and some of that might not be clinically relevant. Like one of the main criticisms I've heard of Viome is that it's so sensitive that it can detect things that may have been growing in your colon like decades ago. They're no longer relevant. But it does, give you a list of foods that might be beneficial. And a lot of people are finding that makes sense for them. They're like, you know what? I'm not really, I don't really do well with grains, but Viome suggested buckwheat and lentils, and I actually do respond really well to those foods. So I think all of these things can act like guides, and it's all about just the trial and error and using it as a springboard to figure out what works for us. So yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, but you said that, it's just something new that you've been implementing. So you
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to see the connections to the DNA test, and like again, seeing that confirmed was like, okay. And actually, there was one thing that kind of made me sad, and I still have to ask them about them. They suggested that I lower my intake of blueberries, and because apparently there was a blueberry virus. So there's viruses that are plant viruses, and even though they don't really affect us in a big way, maybe because we're humans, the plant viruses have still shown in the gut to increase inflammation. So they suggested to, at least for now and for the the next few months cut out blueberries or
Mm.
minimize their intake. Another thing that didn't surprise me was tomatoes for the same reason. But tomatoes, for example, I could see them in my stool sometimes, like very, very tiny, but you can still recognize it. So I've always been of the thinking, if you see something in your stool, like undigested, you shouldn't be eating it.
Mm.
And confirmed, amaranth, kiwicha, quinoa, all these show up in my stool in a big way. Even when I ferment them, soak them, do all those things, no go. And
Mm.
again, the Viome test pinpointed that really well.
Mm.
So
Mm.
there's like some of them are like avoid, don't even eat these ever. So there was
Mm.
mostly plant foods in my case, which also doesn't surprise me because over the course of my whole life, I always notice the more plant foods I eat, usually the more diarrhea and loose stool I get. And the more animal-based foods I eat, the more nice, solid, smooth everything is.
Interesting. Yeah. And I remember from Brazil, like I'd head off with other girls from the surf camp to the buffet to eat the broccoli that they served there. And you'd be like, no, I'm sticking with my raw meat. I'm good.
Broccoli, in fact, is an avoid for me. Broccoli and
Ooh.
all the cruciferous vegetables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a common thing with lots of people. Like some people do well with high sulfur diet and others don't do so well. I'm actually curious. I have a Viome kit and I'm curious to test it out and see and see how
Awesome.
that works. But yeah, this is good. Yeah. And we didn't really get into intermittent fasting, but there's so much more we could talk about. And anything else
And
you want to end with?
a lot of people have been talking about intermittent fasting already. I feel like maybe nowadays it's already getting less sexy. Basically comes down to avoid snacking and
Mm-hmm.
compress your eating window. So I'm now, especially women, because women, again, some people say women are less, can do less fasting hours than men. So every single day, don't eat for 12 hours. So my mom or my auntie asked me, so does that include your sleep? I'm like, yeah, you just stop eating at 7 p.m. and you can start eating at 7 a.m. It's that easy. Just don't eat anything there. And if you can, make it earlier, like from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. because eating a big meal before bed is not really beneficial. Um, but intermittent fasting raises BDNF, raises ketones, which also increases BDNF. Um, Actually, in fact, many times that I was like euphoric happy in my life can be attributed to having a lot of ketones in my blood, probably because I was fasting and because I was very active. I was traveling, so I didn't feel like I want to be eating. I have all the stuff to do. Yeah. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is the thing with intermittent fasting is it's such a sexy term that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm intermittent fasting. But normally they're just not a breakfast person. But now there's a cool term for it. But we have to also define that term because it could mean the 5-2 diet, which is 2 days of the week you don't eat anything, completely fast. At 2 non-consecutive days of the week, and it's a weight loss technique. Or it could mean, like you just said, 12, 12, and 12. So 12 hours of fasting and 12 hours of feeding. And I think typically, which actually isn't based on a lot of the raw science, it's a 16-8. So 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of
That's
feeding.
the one I usually do.
Yeah, and that one I think, so they do have I believe it was the 15-9 is the work of this man called Sachin Patel. Sachin Panda, in California. And I think that it's interesting. Yeah. And it was called time restricted feeding. And so there's a lot of benefits to this. And it's all about, I think what I always tell my patients is it tends to be better for men when they isolate female animals or female humans. They tend to have the opposite effect. So they're actually more insulin resistant. Their hormonal profile shifts towards more testosterone, more stress hormone production. And I think it's just like, do women respond the same way as a man to fasting? Probably not, or especially not long term. So it's all about like just kind of tweaking things. But a 12-12 fast, I think pretty universally is beneficial, and because it's like you're essentially like avoid eating 3 hours before bedtime, give your digestive system a rest, and then your digestive system can do its nightly sort of cleaning and repair jobs that it can't do if it's trying to actively digest something. Like you notice when you're like, if I have a huge protein meal before bed, my sleep's not as good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is great, Ivo. So anything else you want to end off on?
I think I've pretty much explained everything that came to mind. I have some notes here, but I think I
Yeah. Tell us what's in your notes.
only had 5 words written down. Yep, I went over those.
What are the 5 words?
Just right before we started talking, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned this. So I had the story about my grandfather, self-decode, the story about the joke, and I just wrote down one peptide that I wanted to mention. Yeah.
Awesome. This is great. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you
And
for having me.
we'll talk soon. Bye.